Murder. It's a topic a lot of people are interested in. My favorite novels are murder mysteries, especially the ones where people are poisoned. People love true crime and learning how someone thought they got away with a poisoning but didn't. A lot of historical mysteries are about whether or not someone was poisoned or died by natural causes, things we will never be able to determine with the bodies long buried and the potential suspects long dead. I have opinions about the princes in the tower. This is not the time for them, but just know that I have them. Now, you might think that as an historian, I would have thought about the history of criminal investigations. How did we go from solving crimes based off vibes or trial by combat, a thing I have talked about on this channel, to actual investigations into someone's death and trying to figure out what actually happened, be that death by accident or death by deliberate means? Now, what I didn't expect was that a lot of the answer to that question can be blamed, at least in North America, on Prohibition. If you're not familiar with Prohibition, it's the time period from about 1920 to 1933 that Americans talk about as banning the sale, production, and importation of alcoholic beverages, and Canadians remember as a time we don't talk about that explains why some families in Nova Scotia are very, very wealthy. They were rum runners. But it was also a time period, in New York in particular, where the idea of a professional medical examiner's office, one that would determine the difference between people dying of alcohol poisoning brought about by consuming too much illegal hooch, and people who were murdered for the insurance money, to end an unwanted marriage, or because sometimes people just wanted someone dead. There are a surprising number of cases where family members murdered someone using poisoned chocolates. Who knew? Well, the person who knew is Deborah Blum, a science communicator and journalist who wrote The Poisoner's Handbook: Murder and the Birth of Forensic Medicine in Jazz Age New York. Now, you'll notice I didn't say she's an historian because she isn't. She is a trained researcher, so we will forgive her for making the terrible mistake of not being an historian. All the cool kids are historians, but we are very nice. You are allowed to come sit with us at the table. What she does in this book is tell a very compelling story about the establishment of medical examiners as a professional appointment in New York. And she does this by going through how two of those professionals, Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler, worked to figure out what poisons left behind in the body. And I need to tell you, those ways just blow my mind because I cannot imagine who woke up one day and said, okay, first we need to stick some copper rods into their liver. This book takes us through the professionalization of a medical specialty without ever really telling us it's doing that. Instead, it's telling us a story about that professionalization through the various poisonings and accidental deaths that these two men investigated over 21 years, and it is so much fun. My name's Joanna, I'm an historian, and this is a history book I think you'll love. One very important thing before I dive too far into this. Every book I own that mentions radium, Index has chewed on. This book mentions radium, she has chewed on it. She's also chewed on my biography of Marie Curie and my book about the Radium Girls. Both Marie Curie and the Radium Girls make an appearance in this book as a way of highlighting the issues that come from letting businesses decide if their product is dangerous or not, but we will come back to that point. As I've said with every book I've reviewed on this channel, what I think can help folks who aren't historians get into a history book is having a main character they're following through the story. This book does that, but instead of focusing on Gettler and Norris's life, it really focuses on the life of the coroner's office. How does the coroner's office go from being this ridiculous patronage appointment for a drunkard who can't be bothered to take crime seriously to being the most well-respected office in the United States? The focus in this book is how to make the study of crime scientific. Not only does it focus on what Gettler and Norris do to make the city of New York take their work seriously, it also walks us through the ways they develop techniques to determine actual causes of death, the time of death, and the ways that decomposition can affect our understanding of both of these things. And I like how this book is structured. It's like a series of short story murders, each chapter focusing on one type of poison. The chapters start by looking at some suspicious deaths, be it Frederick Moore's coming to confess he's killed a bunch of people through chloroform poisoning, the death of a young woman from eating a pie laced with arsenic, or a grandmother that murdered her granddaughter for being annoying by poisoning some figs. I'm going to be staying with my parents for a little while. I don't think they will find me annoying. Now, to be clear, not every death in this is murder. Several people are found innocent of killing their loved ones through the work that Norris and Gettler did in the coroner's office. And it is never ghoulish. Look, I cannot understate, I'm weak. I cannot stand lurid descriptions of violence or death. This book could have become gross by focusing too much on the details of the bodies Gettler in particular looked at, and while this book does do the thing where it talks about examining someone's liver by mixing it up into a slurry and adding some chemicals to see what color they turn, it doesn't dwell on that. It's about the fight to understand what causes death, to be specific about how a poison works, to ensure people aren't falsely convicted or getting away with a crime because of lack of attention to the details. Trust me, I am weak when it comes to this stuff. If you can read an Agatha Christie, you should be fine with this. Because I'm interested in both medical history and historical true crime, some of these cases are very familiar to me. For example, the murder of Albert Snyder by his wife and her lover. This is the case that inspired the noir classic Double Indemnity, in which the beautiful femme fatale, that's Albert's wife, Ruth, convinces a hapless man, in this case Judd Gray, to help her bump off her husband for the insurance money. In the actual case, the lovers bought life insurance that would pay out twice as much if Albert died by misadventure. So the two cooked up this burglary gone wrong scheme that included several glasses of strong liquor, chloroform, mercury bichloride, and then just beating Albert to death. Spoilers, both murderers were convicted and died by electric chair. There's this episode of Crimes of the Century that I have linked below that's about this case, and I've also linked to the Wikipedia page on Ruth. But as a heads up to my fellow cannot stand gory things, part of the reason this case is so infamous is because a reporter snuck in a camera and got a picture of Ruth just as they were turning on the electric chair, and that picture is on the Wikipedia page. It is not in the book. I just wanted to warn you because I was a bit disturbed that it was just there. Another theme throughout this book that's fascinating to me is how corporate interests end up overriding scientific knowledge when money is involved. I've already alluded to the issues around radium. A lot of people are familiar with the story of the Radium Girls, these young women who were hired by a Radium Corporation to paint the numbers on watch faces with radium-infused paint so they glow in the dark. So on their breaks, they'd paint their teeth in glow-in-the-dark paint, or they'd run their fingers through their hair to give it a sparkle. And then they started dying of mysterious ailments that started in their jaws and moved out from there. The Radium Corporation fought the growing scientific consensus that their suffering and ultimate deaths were caused by day in and day out exposure to radon gas for years, finally settling out of court when most of the women were already dead. Some of them just wanted enough money to pay for their funerals. How do you prove radium is what's causing the problem? And that's something that Gettler and Norris worked on. That isn't the only example in the book of corporate interests overriding worker safety. Blum also talks about the decision made to add lead to gasoline and how the workers at Standard Oil, who were suddenly going crazy, just went insane from working too hard. This is what actually the company claimed, instead of being institutionalized because of lead poisoning. Norris worked to convince the government that lead in gasoline was a problem. My understanding is there was lead in gasoline in North America until 1996, but we did stop having people drink radium to cure all their ills before that, so I guess you win some, you lose some? But the big theme that runs through the entire book is about how Prohibition was a major cause of death and disability in New York and throughout the United States. This was caused by a few different things that Blum keeps coming back to, in part because Gettler and Norris keep coming back to them throughout their careers. Now, if you're like me, a lot of what you know about Prohibition is through how people defied it. If you watched or read The Great Gatsby, part of that story is about how Gatsby was throwing these huge alcoholic parties despite Prohibition. You may be aware that part of why cocktails became a thing is that people were adding mixers to drinks to disguise the terrible taste of illegal hooch. A lot of people in the US were boozing it up in the 1920s, but the quality of alcohol you defiantly drank was very much based on how much money you were able to spend on it. The wealthy could get access to safe alcohol from Nova Scotia or Mexico, while the poor were often drinking cheap street alcohol that contained enough wood alcohol to cause blindness or death. Gettler really pushed that ending the manufacturing of safe alcohol was going to lead to people drinking poison to get their fix, and he was right. The book has several chapters: wood alcohol, methyl alcohol, ethyl alcohol, each of which was used to get people drunk as quickly and cheaply as possible. The government kept adding more and more poison to the industrial chemicals that some bootleggers were using to make their hooch, and argued that if people were taking a risk in drinking it, that was their problem. In practice, what prohibition meant was that deaths attributed to alcoholism rose by 600% as people drank harder liquor more frequently. Even if the poison didn't get them, people would die because their bodies couldn't handle the strength of the liquor. They'd fall into the river or they'd fall asleep in the street and never wake up. Blum talks about this absolutely horrible situation that arose because selling illegal liquor was a lucrative business. I had never heard of ginger jake. It was this tonic that's a mix of ethyl alcohol and ginger, and people would drink it because it made you feel better. With Prohibition, the company that made it was forced to stop production, but they instead started mixing up something else. They mixed this plasticizer that was used to keep plastics from getting brittle with industrial strength alcohols. Together, these things made organophosphate, which would definitely give you a buzz before it killed you very violently, because organophosphate is a neurotoxin. Thousands of people ended up with permanent nerve damage, unable to control their hands or feet because the jake they were drinking cut through the nerve cells in their spinal cord. I can't understate how dangerous this stuff was and is. It's a pesticide. It's used in chemical warfare during World War II, and people were drinking it because for bootleggers what mattered was making money. The hooch was illegal. There was nothing to keep it safe for consumption. What I like about this book is that at its heart, it's a history of medicine. It tells a story about how the New York coroner's office went from chaos and confusion to being the basis of forensic medicine. I'm a bit frustrated with it because it tells the story in a way that implies that the only people doing this sort of work were in New York. The thing about this period of time in the history of medicine is everything is becoming professional. And deciding who is a doctor or a medical practitioner and who is not is happening all over the place. But histories have to focus on something, and a lot of the history of medicine does end up being about New York or Chicago during the 20th century for a reason, and that reason is to annoy me personally. That's it, that's the reason. A thread I found fascinating in light of my other research was how part of that professionalization was actually through how the courts and police use this growing idea of medicine to make a legal system more professional as well. A lot of this book is about how Gettler in particular began to testify in court cases and how much of his research on what poisoning looked like in the body was about being able to prove through the scientific method that a poisoning had taken place. Blum shows how Gettler's testimony went from being considered a joke to being considered the gold standard for determining if a poisoning had taken place. I think you can see similar threads in the history of psychiatry as well, when determining if someone was insane was less about how they acted crazy and more about if a professional psychiatrist could demonstrate that insanity was present. I find myself wanting to chase that rabbit hole of the link between medicine and policing, but that's me, and my idea of a good time is reading a book about the history of map making as a form of colonization, so I may not be representative. Relatedly, my emotional support bookstore set aside this copy of The Island of Lost Maps just for me, and I am really excited about it. It's a true story of cartographic crime, and I don't know what that means. Thank you, Emotional Support Bookstore. I appreciate you. If you're a non-historian looking for a book to ease your way into reading nonfiction history, this is a good one for it. Blum is at heart a storyteller, and she's using her journalism skills to bring you through the story and keep you hooked. But again, it's not just a bunch of disconnected murders and tragic deaths. It's a history that makes an argument about how prohibition and the deaths it brought about led to a greater understanding of how the human body processed poisons. In many ways, it is a great man history in that it's hung around Gettler and Norris and their fight to get the work they did taken seriously by the city of New York. But it's also about how public understanding of something is shaped by the way it's reported on in papers and understood by authority figures. And yes, at its heart, it's a series of tragic stories and broken families, but it's also a history of how scientists fought to have those deaths taken seriously and the importance of the government in regulating what companies can and cannot put in your air, your food, and your water. Anyway, if you've gotten this far, you may have noticed I didn't make videos for a few months. Don't worry, index and footnote are fine. I got really sick in February, and then I had a whole bunch of grading to catch up on, and then suddenly it was the end of term and I had to grade 9 classes worth of final exams, and I just got very, very overwhelmed. Um, Now I'm unemployed. So I have a lot of time to get into the rhythm of like reading books and writing scripts and recording videos. So hopefully I can actually start putting these out at the rate that I would like to. I am really excited about this book called Ghostland, and the one I mentioned earlier about Marie Curie and these women she mentored into science. And I have a book on my shelf about like the history of typewriters. I really want to read the book on the history of typewriters, and I'm really excited about getting back into doing this the way I want to. Unrelatedly, I'm moving. So if I do start posting these videos as regularly as I want to, you can watch the stacks of books behind me get smaller and smaller as I pack them into boxes over the next 6 weeks. So, I mean, that could be fun too. I just can't wait though to talk about, I don't know what the Island of Lost Maps is actually about other than cartographic crime. We'll find out together. Until then, be good to yourselves and be good to each other. And tell your pets I said hi.